Thank you, Tadeusz. Okay, so good evening or good afternoon, everybody. I'm speaking from Paris, France. You just have to excuse me for my English because it's not my native language, but I'll try to be understandable. First of all, about the subject, Renewal of Yiddish Culture in Continental Europe. So this lecture will be mostly based on my own experience and observations. It is not a scientific lecture. I didn't check all dates, and the subject is so wide that I will sure forget a lot, of course. So I will begin with first with my own relationship to Yiddish in a few words. I was born in 1963 in France from a mixed family. My mother was born in Paris from Polish Jewish parents, and my father is from a Catholic French family. And I was 24 when I began studying Yiddish. Before that, I heard some Yiddish in the family of my mother, but they were in Paris. I was in the Alps. It was the time when it took a lot of time to go from Grenoble in the Alps to Paris. So I saw them only maybe once, twice a year. So I wouldn't say that I was I was totally into Yiddish when I was a child. But from my teenage, I was interested by the language. It was the language of my grandfather who perished in Auschwitz 21 years before my birth. And I began studying Yiddish when I was 24, as I said, in Jerusalem in 1987. I spent 1 year in Jerusalem, and I will begin from, so what happened when I came back from Jerusalem to Paris in 1980, end of 87, after a semester of Yiddish studies for Yiddish for beginners with Leah Skiba, a fantastic pedagogue of the language at the Hebrew University. What was the situation in Paris? So the situation in Paris was the following one. There was still the traditional Yiddish culture. At the time in Paris, there was still a lot of native speakers of Yiddish. I could sometimes hear two people in a bus speaking Yiddish, not so often, but sometimes. Or if I wanted to hear the language, I would go in the afternoon to one of the coffee shops of the Place de la République. And there were always a few tables of older people spending their whole afternoon schmoozing in Yiddish. In the kiosk nearby, you could buy the daily newspaper Unser Wort, and the Zionist, labor Zionist Yiddish newspaper. And 3 other daily or weekly newspapers were still available. You have, in the document I shared, you have the list of the 4 Yiddish daily, weekly, or monthly newspapers. So there were the Communist Neue Presse, the Bundist Unser Stimme, and the Zionist religious Unser Weg. There are also still 4 Yiddish libraries in Paris, but only one of them was still really active. That was the Bundist Medem Library. And you have also a list of all the libraries at the end of the first page who were available in Paris at that time. Not all of them in the 80s, 90s were still open, but basically the books were still at their place. I will explain what happened afterwards. A few restaurants like Goldenberg on Rue des Rosiers in the Pletzel traditional Jewish area of Paris on Rue des Rosiers, or Albert International in Belleville, where you could eat a soup of Krepler or Kneidler, and also the bakery of Finkelstein on Rue des Rosiers It was at that time still quite traditional. Now it turned to be Goldenberg and Albert International disappeared maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Finkelstein still exists, but it turned to be a kitsch, very expensive touristic place, even if the quality of the bakery is still very good. So that is for the visible places where Yiddish was still working. But there were less visible places where the renewal of Yiddish culture was in action. So of course, the places and institutions that I described, it was the places of the native speakers. Now let's speak about the places of people who went back to Yiddish in the 70s and 80s. The first I was in contact with was the Yiddish course of University Paris 7, Denis Diderot, the name of the university, situated in the Institute for English and American Studies called Charles VII, a king, created in the middle of the 70s. Who created this institution? It was Rachel Hertel, her name is in the document. Rachel Hertel is the daughter of two Yiddish writers, of Moshe Waldman and Menucha Ram. She was born in Lithuania, and she arrived in France after the war with her parents. And she's a native speaker, of course, and she graduated in English and American literature. And with her job in American literature, she created a Center for American Jewish Studies. And in the Center for American Jewish Studies, she created a small room for Yiddish language and literature. It was the situation in France in the 70s. There was almost no place for Yiddish, and you have to find a way. And Rachel found a way through American Jewish studies to find a way to Yiddish, even if we would read authors from Europe, from Poland, from Soviet Russia, of course, from America too. But the only way to study Yiddish was to go through a Center of American Jewish Studies. And in this same institute, there was another teacher called Yitzhak Niborsky. So Yitzhak Niborsky, he was born in Argentina. He arrived in France at the end of the 70s, in 79, I think. And we will speak more about him, about the Medem Library. And those two teachers were really the two main teachers of Yiddish for my generation in France in the late 70s, in the 80s, and in the 90s, and for Yitzhak Niborsky until now. So who were the students in this university? First of all, when I speak about a university, I speak about 3 hours a week. It was on Wednesday from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. It was not a total cursus of Yiddish studies. It was only 3 hours with 3 or 4 levels. So among the students, I think I was one of the youngest. At that time, I was 25. Most of the people were born in the 30s and 40s. Usually, they heard Yiddish at home. I'm just speaking of a few dozens of people. It was not hundreds of people. And anyway, less than 100, much less than 100. And some of them attended once or a few times the Oxford summer courses created by David Katz in the late 70s, or the Uriel Weinreich summer Yiddish program at YIVO Institute in New York City. Because if you would go only to these lessons once a week, 3 hours a week, it was not enough to get Yiddish language and culture. So I didn't, but they would travel abroad to have a proper education in Yiddish. It was the situation then. And most of the students came from left-minded Jewish families, mostly former communists and Bundists. And as I remember that I was one of the youngest, I was also one between the only ones who considered Yiddish as part of a Jewish whole. Like I also learned Hebrew, for example. I thought that Hebrew is also a possible language. And I also studied and practiced somehow Jewish religion. I thought that Jewish religion was also a possibility. Most of the students came here to have only Yiddish. It was, let's say, a third way. At that time of Jewish renewal, after the, let's say, Six-Day War, there was a Jewish renewal in France. And also after the half revolution of 68, there was a renewal of minor identities. So one way was Zionism, the second way was Jewish religion, and the third way was Yiddish. And it was not mixable, let's say. People who were studying Yiddish were, most of them, not all of them, I don't want to make a generality, but most of them were against Zionism, like very left, or against religion, very, very secular. And I remember in the lessons that when the teacher was explaining Hebraism, a word from Hebrew, coming from Hebrew in the Yiddish language, there was some resistance of part of the audience. Or when we were studying a text of Sholem Aleichem, for example, and the teacher was obliged to explain things about the Jewish religion, some people would say, I didn't come to this lesson to hear about the Jewish religion. So it was not so, like, I think it makes a big difference with the United States, for example, because France is a very secular country, and it had a huge influence of Ashkenazic Jews, this secularity and anti-religious mind of the country. So Yiddish was some kind of third way as a Jewish identity. So I spoke about this first place of also of education and of community in some kind. It was also a way to be in contact with fellow Yiddishists, of course. The second place was the Medem Library. At that time, the Medem Library was ruled by Yitzhak Niborsky, so also a teacher in Charles V and the director of the Medem Library. And but at the library, there was still Kive Weisbrot, who was one of the founders of the library. The library was founded in Paris in 1929, and Kive Weisbrot was one on the last founders, a very active person, a very convinced Bundist, but also a very convinced Yiddishist. And so let's ask, how comes that the Medem Library was still existing in the 80s and still very active in the 80s, and why the other Yiddish libraries were not active? I think it has to do with the fact that it was founded and ruled by Bundist people. For Bundist people, Yiddish was totally organic. So when in the 70s, the old generation of Yiddish-speaking people saw that the population is going down and there is a decline of Yiddish culture. In the communist library, Yiddish was not organic. It was communist thinking with the Yiddish language for spreading the thinking. In the Zionist library, the main language, psychologically speaking, was Hebrew and Israel. It was not Yiddish. In the Bundeslibrary, it was Yiddish. So for Kiewer Weisbrot, there was no way. This library has to stay. There's no choice. That's why at the end of the 70s, he decided to call Yitzhak Niborsky to come in Paris, first of all, to create a catalog, a typed catalog at that time, of course, not computerized. And the first work of Yitzhak Niborsky in Paris was to create this catalog. Because before that, without the brain of Kiewer Weisbrot, you were not able to find a book in the Medem library, because Kiewer knew where the book were. After Yitzhak came in Paris, we were able to find a book according to the cards, to the typed cards, of course. But it was a first step to a renewal, because Kiewer Weisbrot was the one who said, I will bring a younger man from Argentina to rule the library. And in the other libraries, they didn't decide the same thing. That's why those other libraries disappeared in the 90s, and the Medem library was still active. So when Yitzhak Niborsky arrived in Paris, a few Yiddishists learning at Institut Charles V with Rachel Hertel realized that a treasury of Yiddish knowing is arriving in Paris. And Rachel Hertel herself just realized that she will have a big help through Yitzhak Niborsky to develop the Yiddish studies in France. So those few Yiddishists decided to create a society to organize Yiddish lessons and Yiddish seminars, so that Yitzhak would be able to teach on one side in the university, and the other side in a private society, let's say. And so through those two teachers, it was really the two main the renewal of the Yiddish culture in France was on those two feet, let's say, Rachel Hertel and Yitzhak Niborsky. They were my two teachers in France, and I think that it was the fact for lots of people, of my fellows. So through those different lessons, there was the possibility of creating a new generation of scholars. And a few people were active, were studying and then active. Like I want to for example, to quote Carol Xiagenitzer. She became a professor of comparative literature in University Paris III. And in her lessons, she would always introduce works of Yiddish literature, like Thomas Mann compared to Israel Yehoshua Zinger, or Yosef Roth with Yitzhak Bashevis Zinger, and so on. And there was Delphine Bechtel. She created the cursus of Yiddish studies in the German department of University Paris IV. And this department is still existing. She's still teaching there, together with Natalia Krenitska, a scholar of the third generation. She's some younger than my generation. There was Jacques Mandelbaum, Louisette Cahan, Nadia Deon-Rothschild, Viviane Siman, Ariel Sion, and all of them became translators from Yiddish into French, because before them there are very few. Usually the translators knew quite well Yiddish, but they knew less of French than Yiddish, which is a problem when you translate. So this is the first generation of people knowing very good French and knowing quite good Yiddish too. And myself, I was appointed as the director of the Medem Library in 1994. And at that time, it was the time when we collected the books of the other Yiddish libraries. It means that within a few years, the Medem Library turned to be from a library of, let's say, 10,000 books to a library of 40,000 books. And she became the biggest Yiddish library in Europe. And all of this made from Paris an important center of Yiddish education and culture in Europe. I have also to mention the fact that France is the biggest Jewish community in Europe, still, with let's say 500,000 or 600,000 Jews. Half of them are Ashkenazim, around half of them. You don't see them so much because usually most of the Ashkenazim don't go to synagogues or to Jewish traditional centers, but there are still a lot of Ashkenazim in France. And so it's also a very important fact why Paris and France became one of the centers of the renewal of Yiddish culture in Europe. So I entered the Medem Library in 1994, and in year 2000, we created the Maison de la Culture Yiddish Bibliothèque Medem. It means Paris Yiddish Center Medem Library, which was a fusion of the Medem Library together with the AITSI, Association pour l'étude et la diffusion de la culture yiddish, who was this society which organized Yiddish seminars. And in 2014, I decided to quit this function, even if I'm still a member of the board of the Medem Library. And a new director came. His name is Tal Chybowski. He's a young man. He might be 37 now. And we decided to work with this young man because we thought that the problematic of the Yiddish culture has to be thought by a younger person. What else happened in Paris? So a Yiddish theater was created in 2004, which is called the Toim Theater, founded by Charlotte and Alik Messer, and who played in Yiddish with French subtitles. And this theater has produced around several theater plays. What happened out of Paris in France? The main place in France is Strasbourg, at the border between France and Germany. But in France, and Strasbourg is the main city of Alsace, and Alsace is the dialect in Alsace is a German dialect. Usually in France, the dialects are Roman dialects. In Alsace, it's a German dialect. It's important because the Yiddish, the Rafi Goldwasser, who is an actor, the son of a Yiddish actor of Argentina, he made a career in Israel, in Hebrew theater, and he came to France at the end of the 80s, and he created in Strasbourg in around 1992 the Luft Theater, Théâtre en l'air, and he could play in Yiddish also because the audience, the Jewish or the non-Jewish audience of Strasbourg understands German, understands the Germanic dialect of this area, which is not so far from Yiddish. So they could play in Yiddish, and the audience would be able to understand even if there are no subtitles, which is quite important, which is not the fact in Paris. Paris is is really, France usually is a country of one language, not bilingualism, but Strasbourg is quite bilingual. Another very important fact is the creation of summer universities, summer courses created in Paris in 1996, but then it was alternative in Strasbourg, Brussels, in Belgium, and Paris. One year in Paris, 1 year in Strasbourg, 1 year in Brussels, with the same teachers everywhere, like Itzhak Niborski from Paris, Sonia Pinkusevich-Dradva from Belgium, and Helen Chayele-Bir from London. And Sonia and Helen, they both come from, they were both born in Australia, in Yiddish-speaking families, and they went to Yiddish school, like Itzhak Niborski in Argentina. And it makes a big difference. In France, there was never any Yiddish schools, or maybe some Sunday school of a few hours a day. In Australia and in Argentina, there were real serious Yiddish schools of a few hours a day all the week. And it's a big difference, of course. And so this summer course went from Paris to Brussels to Strasbourg. And now the Paris Yiddish Center, thanks to Tal Haver-Chibowski, who was living in Berlin before coming to Paris. He's Israeli, but he was living in Berlin. So the Paris Yiddish Center decided to organize this summer university once in 3 years in Berlin. So it's Paris and Berlin, Paris, Brussels, Berlin now, and not Strasbourg anymore. So what was the typology of students in the Yiddish lessons in the 80s and until now, let's say? What is the typology of students? So in France, the Ashkenazim now turned to be a minority within the Jewish minority. And it's an important fact, because an Ashkenazi who wants to be part of the main Jewish community feels as in a minority in a majority of Jews coming from North Africa. So the contact with Yiddish is a way to find his roots that he couldn't find in a synagogue, for example. And so that is quite important. Let's speak about Europe now. In France, the presence of the Yiddish culture was very strong until the 70s, even the 80s, in Paris specifically. In London, for example, it was not the fact. For example, the Jews, lots of Jews came from Poland to France in the 20s, in the 30s, and even after the war. In London, the Jews came from the Russian Empire at the beginning of the 20th century. It means that in my generation, in a Jewish family in my generation, somebody like me wouldn't hear a word of Yiddish or very few Yiddish in his family. I don't want to generalize, but let's say that it's not so common. In France, it was much more common. So the situation is not the same. An English student would go to the roots of his great-grandparents. In Paris, it's to the roots of my grandparents and not great-grandparents. So it makes a difference. The situation in Belgium is somehow the same like in France. It's more or less the same Jews in Belgium and in France. Yiddish studies in Germany. There are almost no Jews in the Yiddish studies in Germany. It's mostly non-Jewish German people. And as far as I know, and all the people I met there, I felt that this is people who come for linguistic questions, because Yiddish, let's say, is a German dialect, so a linguistic point of view, or some of them come because they have a feeling of a whole. I spoke with a few people saying, for example, I live in Hamburg. There were 30,000 Jews in Hamburg before the war. I feel that there is a hole in the middle of the city because of those vanishing Jews, or the vanished Jews. So it's very, or the feeling that there is a hole in the German society, or a feeling of guilt, of course. So it makes a lot to make people come to Yiddish. In Poland, for Polish students, I used to teach Yiddish at the Warsaw Yiddish summer course in 2010 and 2011, and I spoke with my students. Most of the non-Jewish students said, the history of Jews is part of the history of Poland. Of course, I don't say that every Pole would say the same, but the one who is coming to attend a Yiddish lesson is able to say so. It was usually people who didn't know that there were Jews in Poland, or have a very vague idea about this. And suddenly, for example, suddenly somebody realized that in his village, in his small city, 30%, 40%, 50%, 60% of the population was constituted of Jews before the war. And the history didn't say so, like the government, and if even the city didn't say anything about the presence of Jews before the war. And suddenly they realized that, and they wanted to know more about the Jews, about their language. There were lots of students who were studying history and Jewish history, and so on. And of course, people who are attending Yiddish lessons are very often connected to the idea of a vanished world. It's also quite connected to the history of the Holocaust, of course. And there is also another idea that I noticed, the feeling of a marginality. I noticed that very often the students in Yiddish feels themselves marginal in their own family, or in their own society. For example, there are a lot of LGBT people in the Yiddish studies, and I think that like Yiddish is the marginal language of the world, and so to have a marginal identity, it's a nice way to speak in a marginal language, to say it quickly. So so now we could say that we are in a third generation of Yiddish leaders, or Yiddish teachers, or Yiddish students. The first generation, there was children of Yiddish speakers, native speaker, educated in the Yiddish language, like Rachel Ertel, Yitzhak Niborski, David Katz in Oxford, Helen Beer in London, Sonia Pinkosevich-Dradva in Brussels. They all grew in Yiddish-speaking families. The second generation, this is my generation, people who had some chance to know native speakers, like in my own family, my grandfather, I didn't know my grandparents because they were assassinated during the war, but my grand aunts and uncles, they used to speak Yiddish with my mother, and my mother used to answer them in French. But I heard Yiddish, and I can also speak French with a Yiddish accent because I heard this accent, which is quite important too. It's not Yiddish, but now we speak about people. When I speak with a 20-year-old person, he tells me, I never heard anybody speaking with a Yiddish accent in French or in English or in Hebrew or in Russian, because they all disappeared, or most of them disappeared. And it's quite important to have contact with nostalgia of something. I have the nostalgia of my grand-aunts and grand-uncles speaking with a Yiddish accent in French too. And it's quite important to create an identity and a way to go to a culture, let's say. So in the third generation, this generation is going to Yiddish with no former knowing. They don't know anything. They never heard a word of Yiddish. So it's like a white page, let's say, which is another problematic, of course. So I will finish, because I spoke about the Yiddish studies, but I will finish with a very important area also, which is music, because through music, it's a big way to go to culture too, and to identity, to cultural identity. So on the paper I sent you, there are a few examples. Of course, there are lots of Yiddish singers all over Europe. But what is interesting is that is also creation in Yiddish music. For example, Shura Lipovsky, she is from Amsterdam, but she's active at the Paris Yiddish Center in Paris. She's adapting Yiddish poems, and I gave you a link to a song called "Sis Finster in Gas" that you can hear on YouTube. And so she's adapting Yiddish poems to turn it to a new Yiddish song, let's say. Another example, a fantastic example, is Daniel Kahn. Daniel Kahn is an American guy, but he lives in Berlin, and he is singing Hallelujah, Leonard Cohen Hallelujah. It's a fantastic Yiddish adaptation of this song, of this wonderful song, and it's really Yiddish recreation, and so it's I'm not sure that a lot of people never heard this song because it's very famous, but it's worth to hear it, or to hear it again, because it's a very nice adaptation of Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. And maybe the main center in Europe for creation of Yiddish music, it is in Weimar, in Germany. The Yiddish Summer Weimar, which is a summer university of Yiddish music, was created in 1999 by the American musician Alan Byrne, but he's based in Berlin since 1987. And it's a quite active center for Yiddish music and creation of Yiddish songs and so on. So this is a very quick panorama of the situation in Europe. I think that I remember when I first, all this happened thanks to very dedicated people. Like, I remember when I first spoke about being the director of the Yiddish library in Paris, you have to know that Yitzhak Niborsky, for example, if he knows that you know some Yiddish, he refuses to speak to you in another language than Yiddish. And when we discussed about my contract as a director, I wanted to discuss the details of the contract in French, and he refused. I had to speak Yiddish to say, I want this, and this salary, and this, and so on. And so I think that the renewal of Yiddish culture in Europe was thanks to those crazy people, because it's crazy, but it's not so crazy, because in a culture like the Jewish culture, who was able to recreate a language like Hebrew at the beginning of the 20th century, why wouldn't we recreate a culture at the beginning of the 21st century? So that's, as I said at the beginning, it's a panorama from Paris to the whole of Europe. But of course, it's through my experience. So that's why it was mostly focused in Paris. Even if France, it's one of the most active centers in Europe. So excuse me for the people acting in other countries, if I spend more time on France than on England or Germany or Poland or Lithuania. So this is it, and maybe we can chat now.
Yes, lovely. Thank you very much, Gilles, for this nice and a very nostalgic, I have to say, lecture. And let me just start with an anecdote, because you said that you are sorry that you're speaking so much about France, but no worries. As Woody Allen once said, what we would have done without France. So actually, speaking about this nostalgia, there was this question, actually not question, but let me start with Miriam's Eichler request to say something in French with Yiddish accent.
Je sais pas si je serai capable. T'essayes, je ne sais pas si je serai capable encore de parler français avec l'accent Yiddish. That's it.
Very nice. I hope, Miriam, you are happy for these few sentences, and maybe later Gilles will share a bit more. Okay, so I'm going through the questions which people ask already during your lecture, and I invite you all to ask more. So Herman Cohen from Washington is asking, is it accurate to say that Yiddish spoken in France follows French grammatical construction, as opposed to Yiddish in Eastern Europe that is more like German?
No, it's not the fact. We are there are few, let's say, influence of French on Yiddish in Paris, but very rare, very few. Usually, it's the same Yiddish in France than it used to be in Poland, not with the same accent, but it's the same language. I know, as far as I know, there is one word which is used in Paris and not understandable in the other countries. When you say Grebsen, it's usually Grebs. So, but in Paris, it means to speak too much. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there is now this grammatical. Okay, I have also a question, a bit going away from France. How would you describe the phenomenon, of course, not as big as in France, but phenomenon of Yiddish studies in Central Europe? You mentioned this a bit, but maybe you can say a bit more.
So I know fewer the situation. I must say it's. So I didn't speak a lot about, because Oxford Center for Yiddish Studies was created by David Katz, and then there was an argument there, and so David Katz went to Vilnius in Lithuania, and he created a Center for Yiddish Studies in Vilnius after the fall of the fall of the wall, of course, the Berlin Wall, yes, and there was also a summer university there, so it was quite active during, let's say, 20 years. I don't know, Warsaw, it's an important center with, for example, scholars like Karolina Szymaniak now and other people. It's a very serious place for Yiddish studies, and there's a summer university, and it's very interesting. It's a very interesting summer university because there is a mixed audience of non-Jewish young Polish people, and let's say older Jewish, or not older, but Jewish people from all over the world, from the US, from Western Europe, from Israel, and it's very interesting to see how people are mixing in this summer university, and they are making because there's a very big interest for Jewish culture and Yiddish culture in Poland, so they are translating a lot of things into Polish. I don't know Polish, but I know what they are translating. For example, Karolina Szymaniak published, I think, an anthology of female writings and an anthology of avant-garde poetry, like very, very radical publications.
Okay, so if we are already there, so we will stay in Central Europe for a while, because Esther actually asking as well, but what do you think about this, let's say, generally Jewish phenomenon, like Yiddish touristic quarters or theater in Poland or other places which is played by non-Jews? I mean, what do you as a French Jew is thinking about this?
So I wouldn't say that my opinion is the main French opinion. I think that I'm quite shocked when people say the Yiddish theater in Warsaw is not worth anything because it's played by non-Jews, not knowing a word of Yiddish. It is theater. It could be a nice play, or it could be not a nice play. That's an artistic question. But the fact that why does a Jewish a Yiddish actor has to be a Jew or has to be fluent in Yiddish to play in a Yiddish play? It's not, for me, it's not a question. And the fact that you can see a Yiddish play in Warsaw is good. It means that it exists. If there's an audience, why not? Why not? So that's my opinion. I know it's not the main opinion, but and the artistic side of Jewish tourism in Poland. So there's some kitsch in it. I know there is some kitsch in it, but there is also kitsch in Rue des Rosiers in Paris now. I preferred Rue des Rosiers when it was a really Jewish street with lively street. Now you have only falafel and tourists eating falafel and having Käskirchen too, cheesecake too. It's like Poland's like that. What can I do? But I'm not especially critical about that.
Okay. Okay, so we come back to France with another question. Susan is asking, do you feel that Yiddish has a future among young people in France outside the Haredi culture?
That's the experience of Paris Yiddish Center. Now there are about 150 students every year, and people, younger people, are coming all the time and all the time and all the time, and we just can say it's still going. It's still going, and I would quote the wiseness of Yitzhak Niborski, saying, "I don't know what will happen in 10 years. Just on Monday morning, I have a lesson, I go to my lesson, I have students, I'm teaching, and then I go back home. And tomorrow I will come back for my new lesson. And that's it, one day after another." But there are students. There are students in the summer universities too, which is a very interesting and important phenomenon. Because of course, Yiddish is a very spread culture. There are people wanting to learn Yiddish all over Europe and all over the world. We are very lucky in Paris because we have a library of 40,000 books, and we have lessons, and we have theater, and we have a way to hear Yiddish, because in Paris Yiddish Center, you can hear 50% of the people are speaking fluently Yiddish and speaking to one another in Yiddish. So if you want to hear Yiddish in Paris, you come to the Paris Yiddish Center and you hear Yiddish. It's not the fact in other places in Europe. So the summer courses are very important because it's an island. It's an island of Yiddish culture during three weeks. It's the lingua franca, the common language of everybody. And then after 3 weeks, people are going back to their places and coming back a year later. So it's quite important.
Nice. Then we have another question, and I think later I will try to unmute some of the people because I'm sure some of you would like to say thank you, or maybe I'm sure there are some Yiddish speakers among our audience. Maybe you would like to chat in Yiddish for a while, just for emotional and nostalgia. But Ellen is asking, actually, I will read it because it's a longer question. But continuing with the question above regarding Yiddish among Hasidim or Haredim, has this been left out today because this community's literary or not observant linked cultural outpost is largely outside the framework of what is usually studied as literature?
Well, so first of all, I have to say that the situation is not the same in London, for example, and in Paris. In Paris, there is no Haredi Yiddish-speaking community, or very few. It's a few families coming from the US or from England. But I think after the war, the Lubavitcher and the other Haredim, they went to other countries because they knew that in France, with the secularity of the country, it's almost impossible to be a Haredi in France. It was impossible at that time. That's why there are very few Yiddish-speaking Haredim in France. The links between the Haredi world and the secular Yiddish world there are very few links. Maybe more in New York, for example, but in Europe there are very few. Sometimes I went to London just to check what happens in the Orthodox neighborhoods, and I saw young girls or young guys going out from school and speaking to one another in Yiddish, not only to the parents, but a 7-year-old young girl speaking to her friend in Yiddish. It's the fact that the Yiddish is a lively language. And so there's no problem in the Haredi community. There are maybe 1 million Haredim in the world speaking Yiddish in the everyday life, and they are growing very fast. So Yiddish has a huge future in this community. In the secular world, it's mostly militant people, militant for the language, let's say for the purity of the language as it was spoken and written in Poland between both world wars. So they are quite critical with the language of the Haredim nowadays, which is a mixture of English, of modern Hebrew, and so on. So it's quite different of the Yiddish we speak in Paris Yiddish Center, for example. And the Haredim are not so interested in modern literature, let's say. They're interested in Torah, in more traditional literature, but not in the great Yiddish writers of the 20th century. That's why this gap is it's difficult to do without this gap. But sometimes there are some links, and at that time it's very interesting. When I go to a tish in Jerusalem on Friday night, and I speak Yiddish with people, they welcome me on a wonderful way because I speak Yiddish, even if they know that I'm a secular Jew.
Nice, very nice. Okay, another question I see from Catherine, quite interesting. Nowadays, it seems that we cannot separate the Yiddish from Hebrew, or the bandits from Zionist, secular from religion, because they are part of a culture. What do you think about this?
We cannot separate Hebrew from Yiddish.
Yes.
So now there are much more people. When I began learning Yiddish, I began learning Hebrew too. And that time in France, it was an exception, as I said. Nowadays, there are much more people learning both languages because they consider that to be a Jew, as they want to be a Jew, they have to learn both Yiddish and Hebrew. So in that way, I can understand that Yiddish and Hebrew, it's the same battle, let's say, but it's not the same language. It's two different languages. That's why I don't really understand the question.
Yeah, honestly, me neither. But what we will do, I will unmute you now, I mean the panelists, and you could say some things. Can you say some, the people who are in the panelist room, do you want to say something or no, we don't hear you. So maybe it doesn't work. Whoever would like to speak, please raise your hand and then I will unmute you from the panel. If you also have more questions, you can ask them. Or you would like to say something in Hebrew, please raise your hand. No, seems like they are not. Pity, I thought we will speak a bit, we'll speak Yiddish.
So, may I say something? React?
Yes, of course.
Because you said it's lots of nostalgia. For me, Yiddish is not nostalgic. It's been part of my life for 40 years now. And maybe now lesser because I don't work anymore in Paris Yiddish Center. But when I used to work in the Yiddish Center, I used to speak Yiddish 50% of the time. And I'm corresponding with people all over the world in Yiddish. So it's a very vivid language for me. It's not nostalgia.
Okay.
And because I spoke Yiddish to my children, they don't really speak Yiddish, but I can say whatever I want in Yiddish and they understand. And that's a big joy for me.
Lovely. That's really lovely. Listen, except of the questions we had, there were also a lot of great feedback. Many people wrote that this were really great and interesting lecture. There was another request to say additionally something. If you want to say maybe something short, like thank you for your attendance, it will be nice.
Yes, of course. I was very happy to speak about this subject. It's I feel even if I'm lesser involved in Yiddish now than I used to be, it's still very important for me, and it's for me it's quite it's really amazing what happened in the last 30 years in the Yiddish world, because I remember in the middle of the 80s, some people would say, who will be the last person closing the door of the Madame Library? Older people thought, and also what was interesting, when I really wanted to speak Yiddish to those older people, I spoke Yiddish with them, and they answered me in French. For them, if you were not born in Poland, you were a goy, even if you are a Jew. You are somebody with whom you have to speak French and not you have to speak Yiddish. I think that's why the language had such a decline, not only because of the Holocaust, because of that generation didn't speak Yiddish to the children and grandchildren. And that's interesting.
Yes, it is. There is also actually not a question, but a comment from Miriam Eichler. She just reminded me, she asked you, are you familiar with the book Outwriting History, The Amazing Adventure of Men Who Rescue a Million Yiddish Books by Aaron Lansky?
So I know the action of Aaron Lansky, of course, in the US, but it's not Europe. Of course, he rescued. So he made a tremendous work in the US, gathering all the books that the families didn't want anymore because they were not able to read them anymore, the books of the parents or grandparents. In the Madame Library in Paris, we did the same too. We gathered all books from all over France and sometimes Europe of people who were not able to read them anymore. But it's much lesser books because it's not US, it's France. So
yes, of course.
And Mendy Kahan made the same thing in Tel Aviv with Young Yiddish. He gathered all Yiddish books.
Which now has a problem due to the soon closing central bus station where the library is placed. So, but I'm sure we will find a new place. And also, Miriam also asked if you are familiar with Anthony Russell, a Jew by choice, trained in opera and now becoming an expert in Yiddish singing, folk music, but he lives in Massachusetts. So
no, I don't know him.
Okay, lovely. I would also like to tell to our audience that this current lecture is recorded and will be available under the link which I just sent you. And also, I don't want to finish at the moment, but I would like to ask you the last question. In your current profession, which means you own the business, you own the Antelope Publishing House, do you also publish maybe, I mean, I know you've published some Yiddish translations, but do you also publish some current French, Jewish literature or Raising Stars? And thank you for the website. Yes.
Yes, we are publishing, we have 32 books in our catalog now. We are publishing about 5 books a year. And I would say that 25% is Hebrew literature translated into French, 25% Yiddish literature translated into French, 25% French literature written in French about Jewish experience, let's say, the Jewish fiction, and the rest is other languages. So it's very balanced. What we are trying to do, it's like the expression Jewish literature in France is really very weird. France is not US or Poland. France is like a very secular Republican country. Like there is, in principle, there is only one French identity. So you would say it's French literature from a Jewish writer, but Jewish literature is really weird for the French audience. So we wanted to create this expression in France. And so we received books from non-Jews speaking about Jews. And it's very interesting. We are creating something. And the authors are chatting in our catalog, like Israeli authors. There's a young French Lebanese author called Sabil Roussoub. He wrote a book called The Jewish Nose, for example, because he said, I'm an Arab, but I was always considered as a Jew because I have a big nose. It's a joke, of course, but it's not only a joke. And so, how to be an Arab in a Jewish skin, or a Jew in an Arab skin, or something like that. And he's playing about all the cliches about Jews and Arabs in France. And it's like we are touching those interesting questions of identities. Or another book of this young French guy of Cameroon origin, born in France, and he went to prison because he was dealing drug. And in prison, he was in the same room with a Jew, a practicing Jew, and he just understood that through studying the text and really having a good knowledge of language, you can have emancipation in life, like through the Jewish tradition of learning and of of pulling the language, you can be a real human being in the French society.
And and done in prison. This is very unique.
Yes, in prison. Yes. His book is called Prisons.
Prisons. Okay, so I advise all of you to visit the website of Gilles Publishing House, which I again write it down in our chat. And let's hope that some of the books you're publishing will be also translated to English, because this is the lingua franca of today, and maybe one day also to Hebrew. Gilles, thank you very much. It was really fascinating, very interesting, and we have really a lot of good feedback if you see. If not, so I will send you later. Thank you all of you for coming this evening or this afternoon, and all the best.
So thank you all of you for listening to me. Goodbye. Thank you, Tadeusz, and thank you for inviting me. Bye-bye.
Bye, ciao.